Welcome everyone to the MOOC course on Introduction to Sociology 2. Today our topic is a brief introduction to post-structuralism. In this topic we begin with what post-structuralism means. We have already studied what structuralism is. We have seen the basic tenets of structuralism. Now let us look at what post-structuralism is. Post-structuralism is not a displacement from, it is not a fall from, nor is it a derivation of structuralism. It is not an imperfect copy of structuralism. Rather, post-structuralism is a linguistic exercise. It is an attempt to dismantle the logos. It is an attempt to dismantle the center and the figure of authority. It is a linguistic exercise in which meaning making takes place on the surface itself, rather than it taking place in the realm of an underlying structure which only gives imperfect copies onto the surface. In post-structuralism, there is an attempt to challenge the sense of doership, to challenge the sense of authorship. So post-structuralism is an attempt to bring everything to a horizontal plane, to make it a series of signifiers, rather than a signified making meaning of the signifier. Post-structuralism begins with a critique of structuralist analysis. In the critique of structuralist analysis, we begin with Pierre Macheret's critique. We find this in the work of Robert Young. Pierre Macheret's critique of the idea of an original perfect essence versus an imperfect derivative. So Pierre Macheret critiques Plato's idea of a perfect model. Plato had this idea of a perfect model from which we make imperfect derivatives. According to Pierre Macheret and according to post-structuralists, we cannot have such an idea of an absolutely perfect ideal model from which we have imperfect derivatives of our everyday world. Pierre Macheret also critiques the assumption of a harmony, the assumption of a theology of creation, the assumption of interdependent parts creating a whole. So here the critique is of structuralism, and whereas structuralism assumes that there is a harmony among the various elements involved, post-structuralism creates a sense of unease, a sense of being unfit. Post-structuralism is also a process of auto-critique. It is an unbound movement through space and time. Post-structuralism, as said before, occurs on the surface, and it is unlimited, and the process of post-structuralism continues across space and time. Post-structuralism is therefore self-reflexive. It avoids becoming fixed. To that extent, post-structuralism critiques the very process of meaning creation itself. While structuralist analysis assumes a general structure from which contingent texts are derived, post-structuralism refuses the very idea of a model that is transcendent to texts. Rather, it sees each text as its own model. Each text is thus created in its difference. Thus we find that whereas in structuralism there was the idea of an underlying structure, an underlying perfect structure which informs that which occurs on the surface, in post-structuralism we don't have such a structure which is underlying the imperfect structure on the surface. Rather, in post-structuralism, everything that occurs on the surface itself. So this is a linguistic exercise which is visible on the surface itself. There is no concept of an underlying author. Post-structuralism poses certain challenges to theory. It challenges the very assumption of theory as a perfect hypothetical model. It challenges the assumption that theory is somehow better than practice, that theory is somehow ideal and perfect, and that only in practice imperfections happen. It challenges the very idea of theory as divorced from practice. Rather, it sees theory and practice along the same line. Post-structuralism also challenges the idea of a model that is superior to its derivatives. It challenges the status of a model that is considered to be superior to its derivatives. Post-structuralism also challenges the idea of criticism as a mere commentary, representation, or description. So according to the post-structuralists, criticism is not simply a commentary. Criticism is not just a description of an already existing work. Criticism in itself, or critique in itself, is a productive exercise, according to the post-structuralist school. Therefore, it may be said that in post-structuralism, we go from meaning to staging. We go from the signified to the signifier. We go from the vertical to the horizontal. As mentioned before, the post-structuralist school focuses on bringing everything onto a horizontal plane rather than on a vertical pole. In the post-structuralist school, what we find is the figure of the authority, which in a vertical line is no longer on top. In the post-structuralist school, the authority figure has no place whatsoever. Everything happens on a contesting surface. This doesn't mean that there is no conflict. It simply means that the conflict happens on the surface itself. While structuralism locates patterns, rules, and structures in the lung, while it sees the signified and the signifier as compounding to form the sign, post-structuralism sees the sign itself as a perpetual signifier, with its meaning perpetually deferred, never reached. While the structuralist school has the idea of the underlying lung, which has a set of patterns which we take from and with which we use permutations and combinations to make our own speech. In the post-structuralist school, what we find is speech in itself, on the surface, as we use it, is in itself valuable. In post-structuralism, what we find is the signifier is not simply an empty vestibule. In post-structuralism, we do not need the signifier to be informing the signifier with concepts. Rather, we can say that the signifier itself, when we look at it in the dictionary, for instance, it leads us to more signifiers. The best example of this is the dictionary itself. When we open a dictionary to look for a meaning of a word, we are not given the meaning itself. We are not given the concept behind it. We are given another set of words. When we look for the meanings of those sets of words, we are taken to another set of words. Therefore, when we open a dictionary, we don't exactly reach the meaning of a word. We don't reach the concept behind a word. We only reach more and more words. It is a perpetual stretch of signifiers. That is what post-structuralism is discussing. So in post-structuralism, we find that meaning is never reached. Meaning is perpetually deferred. The signified is never reached. The sign is never reached. It is only a stretch of signifiers, a perpetual stretch of signifiers. Let us now look at the contributions of Roland Barthes, who is one of the foremost post-structuralist thinkers. In the contributions of Roland Barthes, we will look at the essay Death of the Author, and we will also look at the chapter From Work to Text in the book Image, Music, Text. The idea of the death of the author, as the name suggests, challenges the position, the status of the author, challenges the position of the authorship itself. It challenges the sense of doership. So when we are reading a text, there is no reverence that we owe to the author anymore. When we are reading a text through the post-structuralist lens, we don't necessarily have to revere the author. Rather, we can engage in a productive critique of the text itself. Therefore, Roland Barthes concludes his essay by saying that the birth of the reader has to be accompanied by the death of the author. Through this, we understand that Roland Barthes attempts a dismantling of the logos, a dismantling of doership, and a dismantling of authority. Before we begin an analysis of his chapter From Work to Text, let us understand where the post-structuralist school derives its politics from. The post-structuralist school has been highly influenced by Freudianism and Marxism. Both Freudianism and Marxism are schools of thought which challenge the figure of the authority. While in Freudianism, the figure of the father is challenged, in Marxism, the figure of the bourgeois authority is challenged. And both these philosophies of Freudianism and Marxism had tremendous influence on the social sciences, and it is through this influence that we understand post-structuralism. Therefore, throughout the post-structuralist school, we find these attempts to dismantle the figure of authority. Let us now look at Roland Barthes' contribution From Work to Text. Roland Barthes says that the text is a methodological field experienced in the activity of production. The work can be held in the hand, but the text is held in language and only exists in the movement of discourse. This means that the work is the work of the author, the book that we hold in our hands, the book that we read with our eyes, or the article that we read with our eyes. That is the work. But the text is what happens in the realm of concepts. The text is what happens in the realm of language, in the realm of discourse. And the text can only take place in the productive activity of the reader. The work is produced by the author, but the text is produced by the reader. And therefore, the text is a methodological field, and it is experienced by the reader. The very act of reading the text involves an act of production. When we are reading a work, we are simply consuming, but when we are reading the text with a critical eye, we are engaging in a work of production. Secondly, Roland Barthes says, the text does not stop at good literature. It cannot be contained in a simple division of genres. If a text poses problems of classification, it's because it always involves a certain experience of unfits. This means that works of literature or works in film or any kind of work can be categorized in genres. But the moment the reader engages with that work as a text, it cannot be categorized in genres anymore. The moment the reader engages with the text, it becomes a vastly more complex field, and it cannot any longer be held in minute and limited divisions of genres. Nor is the text limited only to good literature. It includes all kinds of misfits. Thirdly, the text can be approached, experienced in reaction to the sign. The work closes on the signified, but the text practices infinite deferment of the signified. Its field is that of the signifier, and the signifier is not the first stage of meaning. The signifier is not just the material vestibule, but in complete opposition to this as its deferred action. This means that the work is dependent on meaning making. The work makes sense when we make meaning out of that work. The work makes sense when we reach the meaning within it. However, when we are reading it as a text, then it does not stop at the signified. When we are dependent on meaning making, then the signified becomes important. The concept behind the word becomes important. When we are reading it as a text, then we are involved in the realm of the signifier. We are no longer limited only to the meaning, only to the concept, but rather to the very deferment of meaning itself. The signifier perpetually defers the meaning of the word. When it is a perpetual stretch of signifiers, we never reach the meaning of the word. And such is the very nature of production of the text. Number 4, the text accomplishes the very plural of meaning. The text is an irreducible plural. The text is not a coexistence of meaning, but rather a passage. It answers not to an interpretation, but to an explosion, a dissemination. The plural of the text depends not on an ambiguity of its contents, but on the stereographic plurality of its weave of signifiers. The reader is at a loose end. What he perceives is multiple, irreducible, coming from disconnected, heterogeneous variety of perspectives and substances. This means that the text is plural in its very nature. When I say that the text is plural, this does not mean that the text is ambiguous. It simply means that when the reader is approaching the text, when the reader is standing at a point and watching the text unfold, then the text unfolds as an explosion, as a dissemination. From a variety of sources, it finds its information and reaches the reader. And the reader confronts it all. The reader faces it all. The point of view of the reader, the text is thus a dissemination from a number of sources, and it is not limited to one source alone. It is not limited to the author alone. The reader is thus involved in a productive exercise and a productive engagement with the text. Number 5, the work has an author or a father figure, a creator. A process of filiation is involved. The text reads without the inscription of the author. Work grows by vital expansion or development. The text is a network. If the text extends itself, it is a result of a combinatory systematic. Hence, there is no vital respect in the realm of the text. This means that when a work is being produced or when a work is being developed, be it a book or a film or any kind of work, when it is being developed, it has a father figure. There is thus a vital development involved in the creation of the work. However, when we engage with the work in the form of a text, then the text becomes a network. It no longer has a father figure. The text is not created by the author. The text is absorbed by the reader. The text is engaged with by the reader. Thus, there is no vital respect involved when we are engaging with a work in the form of a text. For as long as we respect the figure of the author, there is an aspect of critique which we cannot engage in. However, the moment we reduce the figure of the author, the moment we engage with the work in the form of a text without a central figure of the author, then we can engage with it completely in the process of production. The work is an object of consumption, but the text decants the work from its consumption and gathers it up as play, as activity, production, and practice. The text requires us to abolish the distance between writing and reading by joining the reader and the work into a single signifying practice. This means for as long as we blindly consume the work without engaging with it critically, it remains an act of blind consumption. However, when we engage with the work in the form of a text, then we decant the work and we engage with it as a form of play, as a form of activity, and we produce the text with our engagement. The text abolishes the whole distance. It removes the distance between the reader and the work, and it joins both the reader and the work into an activity of production. Finally, the final approach to the text is that of pleasure. The pleasure of reading the work is a pleasure of consumption, for we can only read them, but not rewrite them, and thus we are cut off from the process of production. On the other hand, the text consists of jouissance, or pleasure without separation. Therefore, when we are engaging with the text, we are not removed from the process of production itself. But when we are reading the text, then the pleasure that we are engaged in is a pleasure of jouissance, it's a pleasure of production itself. Next, we look at the contributions of Lévi-Strauss. Claude Lévi-Strauss engaged with post-structuralism while bringing in his knowledge of anthropology as well. His ethnographic experiences played an important role in his theory. We look at his work, The Savage Mind. In The Savage Mind, Lévi-Strauss begins with the critique of elitism linked to the abstract vocabulary. So here Lévi-Strauss says that certain civilizations, for instance the Western civilization, tends to look down upon other civilizations which may lack abstract words to express certain abstract concepts. According to Lévi-Strauss, the very presence of abstract words in itself is no indication of the advancement of that civilization. Lévi-Strauss goes on to clarify the importance of classification in indigenous native languages, which are non-European, which are tribal languages. He goes on to clarify the importance of classification in these languages. There is a need for order in indigenous languages. And this need for order allows the people of that language, allows the people of that culture to make categories out of the world around them, to bring an order into their world. This process of bringing order into their world involves a very scientific and a very logical process of categorizing the objects around them. And this logical and scientific process need not always adhere to the logic that is followed in Western societies. Nonetheless, it has its own rationality and its own reason for categorizing the world around them in that way. Lévi-Strauss also goes on to clarify the importance of magical rites and beliefs. The belief in rituals, the belief in some kinds of magic, according to Lévi-Strauss, is not detached from logic. Rather, it is simply a belief in a kind of process which perhaps the Western variety of science has not yet discovered. Lévi-Strauss goes on to explain the concept of bricolage and connect it to the idea of the myth. A bricolier is a person who creates with the elements that are available to him. A bricolier does not create the elements from scratch. He simply makes use of the things that are already available to him. According to Lévi-Strauss, myth is a bricolage that can be found in the intellectual world. In the creation of a bricolage, activity and production is not in the ability to create new things, but in the ability to rearrange that which has already been provided to us. So Lévi-Strauss talks about how, in the creation of a bricolage, the bricolier does not create new things, but simply rearranges that which is available to him. If we engage with this further, we will find that this too dismantles the idea of an authority, dismantles the idea of the logos or the center or the author. This is because the bricolier does not create new things, he does not make new things, therefore he is not the author of the things, he is simply rearranging them. There is also no essential center to this rearrangement. There is no essential center to the bricolage, and therefore once again the bricolage as well is a post-structuralist process. Lévi-Strauss goes on to say that the myths and rites preserve the remains of methods of observation and reflection which were adapted to discoveries which nature authorized from the beginning of a speculative organization. Bricolage explains who this prior science could have been on a plane of speculation. A bricolier works with his hands and with the diverse set of limited things at his disposal. Mythical thought expresses itself through the diverse repertoire which, though extensive, is limited. Thus, mythical thought is an intellectual bricolage. The set of bricolier's means can only be defined through their potential use, each representing a set of actual possible relations. Similarly, the elements of mythical thought are somewhere between percepts and concepts. We cannot separate percepts from the concrete situations where they appear, while a recourse to concepts would require that they could provisionally put its objects in brackets. This means when we are looking at the concept of the bricolage, we look at something that is removed from the idea of authorship, because it depends not only on the author, it does not depend on who the author is, it depends on the already available potential elements at our disposal. Next, we briefly look at the works of Foucault and understand how he developed post-structuralist thought. Foucault interrogates the very basis of structuralism for its belief in a form of axiomatic rationality, much like the human sciences. Foucault interrogates the very basis of the foundation of human sciences, for he seeks to understand knowledge whose practice conceals its own fabrication, and thereby reveal the unconscious of knowledge, or the discursive rules and categories that form any discourse while remaining unthought of. His archaeology thus articulates the rules that determine our knowledge. We next look at the contributions of Jacques Derrida, who is also one of the foremost post-structuralist thinkers. Derrida engages in revolutionary textual criticism and turns attention away from structures and relations to movements in language itself. Derrida denies even the possibility of literal meaning, for that would imply the absolute self-presence of meaning, whereas language is constituted by difference. Representation differs the presence of the signified, so the sign differs and differs. The sign involves spacing, that is, absence of everything from which it is differentiated, and the sign cannot represent what it signifies or make the signified present, because the sign implies that thing's absence. Finally, we look at the works of Deleuze and Guattari. Deleuze and Guattari developed the concept of rhizomatic and arborescent forms of thought and writing. The rhizomatic is based on a horizontal plane with multiple conflicting, contesting points of origin, devoid of a logos, devoid of a sacrosanct hierarchy, whereas the arborescent form has a clear vertical hierarchy. We find Deleuze and Guattari engaging in rhizomatic thought even in the writing of their book, A Thousand Plateaus. The book is written in such a way that we can start reading from any chapter. We do not have to begin from the first chapter and move on to the last. They have deliberately written the book in such a way that we can begin reading from any chapter. This in itself is a deeply rhizomatic exercise. Further, the book is named A Thousand Plateaus, implying both multiplicity and a removal of a peak, the removal of a logos, the removal of a vertical authority. Deleuze and Guattari's concept of rhizomatic structure can also be found in our material world. For example, if we look at the caste system, which is found in India, in Japan, and in many other parts of the world, we will find, although the caste system has been discussed by certain authors in a vertical manner, implying a vertical structure, nonetheless, if we look at the works of M.N. Srinivas, if we look at the works of Dipankar Gupta, who have done ethnographic work on caste, who have gone into the field and studied the field of caste, then we find that caste actually has a rhizomatic structure. Caste has a structure which has contestations. Of course, there are hierarchies within caste, but nonetheless, there are always contestations against those existing hierarchies. The very nature of the caste system is such that various discrete castes have been contesting with one another for status. While there is of course a hierarchy, such hierarchy is not unilinear, it is not monolithic, nor is it pan-Indian. In various parts of India, the same caste may have varying status, depending on the local authority structure. Therefore, when we can use the concept of the rhizomatic field to understand various social phenomena as well. Deleuze and Guattari's idea of the arborescent and rhizomatic structure is therefore useful both in the linguistic domain as well as in the material domain of our social economic world. In conclusion, we revise what we have studied on the topic of post-structuralism. To begin with, post-structuralism is not a fall from structuralism. It is not a derivation of structuralism. It is a productive critique of structuralism. Post-structuralism is engaged in the destabilizing of the logos, in the destabilizing of the figure of the authority or an essential center. This is because post-structuralism is heavily influenced by Marxism and Freudianism, both of which are engaged in the destabilizing of the authority figure. While Marxism tries to destabilize the figure of the bourgeois authority, Freudianism tries to destabilize the authority of the father figure. And post-structuralism, being influenced by both Marxism and Freudianism, is thus constantly engaged in destabilizing the figure of the author in the linguistic domain. In the post-structuralist school, we have studied the works of Roland Barthes, Claude Lévi-Strauss, Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, Gilles Deleuze, and Félix Guattari. With this, we conclude the study of a brief introduction to post-structuralism. Thank you.